North Korean leader Kim Jong Un has arrived in Russia, where he's expected to hold a highly anticipated meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The talks have sparked Western concerns about a potential arms deal for Moscow's war in Ukraine. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our international affairs editor, Philip Turle. Hi, Philip. This visit by Kim Jong Un to his Russian counterpart in Russia, shrouded, I think it's fair to say, in a fair bit of mystery.
Well, nothing has been formally announced yet about whether these talks are going to take place, if they're going to take place at all, and where they are going to take place. What we do know is that Kim Jong Un has arrived in Russia. He's arrived in Vladivostok. Why is that important? That's important because Vladimir Putin is there at the moment for the Eastern Economic Forum, which is due to end tomorrow. So there are rumours that the two men could meet after that date. Now, this is the seventh international trip by Kim Jong Un since he came to power in 2011, but the first one since 2019 and just before the COVID crisis, where North Korea just closed down, all the borders were sealed, no one was let in or out. So this is the beginning of a new series, maybe, of international trips by the North Korean leader. So the last time he went out of the country, it was to Vladivostok. This time around, he's also going to Vladivostok, situated about 800 kilometers away from Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, a little bit further by rail. So what we don't know is when this meeting is going to take place and if it is going to take place, but it has been announced already by the US Secret Services, this trip, and then that was confirmed by the Russians, and then after that by the North Koreans. Now, what we also know is that Kim is being accompanied by three very important officials, which also add elements as to what he will be discussing with Vladimir Putin if those talks take place. The first one is the head of munitions policies in North Korea. The second one is the chairman of the Space, Science and Technology Committee. And there's also the Navy administrator linked with North Korean efforts to acquire spy satellites and nuclear-capable ballistic missile submarines. So it looks as though if that meeting does go ahead, there is going to be quite a lot of discussions on the buying and selling of weapons and relations between North Korea and Russia. But as I speak, and as I've been saying, we don't know exactly when those talks will take place between those two leaders.
Now, you've touched on this a little already, Philip, but what's at stake here for both men?
Well, on the part of Vladimir Putin, he needs weapons. So as far as he is concerned, this is going to help him in his war effort with Ukraine. That's the first point. He wants munitions. He wants anti-tank missiles. All of those can be made available in North Korea because North Korea hasn't had any conflict for 70 years since the end of the Korean War in 1953, not even the end, the ceasefire between the two countries in 1953. So there are vast swathes of weapons available in North Korea which could eventually be used by Russia in the war in Ukraine. The problem for Russia is that these weapons are not on the same scale technologically as the ones that are being given to Ukraine by the United States and by the West. So they can't compete with Western munitions. What they can do is to drag this war on further. They can make it much more difficult for Ukraine to win the war. And I think that's what Vladimir Putin has in mind, to make this more into a war of attrition. The second point on that agenda is to put pressure on the West, to bring them to the negotiating table, to say, look, you're not going to win this war in Ukraine. We have the weapons. We're getting these weapons from other sources. The longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be. So come to the negotiating table to work out some kind of solution with us, which, of course, is something that, for the moment, Ukraine has refused to do, and also the West. Now, as far as the North Koreans are concerned, they definitely need money. The country is in bad way. There is hunger. There is energy that is badly needed. All of those items Russia can give to them. So they also want technology from Russia. They also want weapons technologies, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear-capable ballistic missile submarines and military equipment. And they also want spyware. They also want to have spy satellites which they can use to spy on their neighbours, on the United States, on Japan, for example, on South Korea. Something else also I think that is important on the agenda here is to put pressure on South Korea, because South Korea is providing weapons also for the war in Ukraine, to put pressure on South Korea not to do that by this deal being signed eventually between Russia and the North Koreans. So all of those are fundamental facts. So it's going to be, I'll give you this, I'll give you that. Bottom line here is that if you think about the situation, North Korea has always depended on Russia to keep it above ground. This time round, it's Russia that's going knocking on North Korea's door asking for weapons. So there is a sort of change around in the situation.
Now, of course, this meeting being very closely watched by the international community. How is it being perceived in the United States specifically?
That's quite an interesting question, because there could be grounds for concern in the United States about the fact that Vladimir Putin is going to be meeting with the North Korean President Kim Jong Un. There is concern about the nuclear program in North Korea, whether or not North Korea is going to be able to develop a nuclear weapon anytime soon. So all of these different elements brought together have raised some concern in Washington. But there's also some kind of sarcastic remarks coming out from the United States. This is one of them from John Feiner, the US Chief Deputy National Security Advisor, who says we have serious concerns about the prospect of North Korea potentially selling weapons and additional weapons to the Russian military. It's interesting to reflect for a minute on what it says, that when Russia goes around the world looking for partners that can help it, it lands on North Korea. There have been other remarks from officials in Washington saying, well, that's also a sign, if you like, of Russian weakness. It can't get those weapons from anywhere else. It's had to go knocking on the door of an international pariah, which is North Korea, which is Kim Jong Un, to ask for his support when it's always been Russia which has been supporting North Korea. So it says something about the weakness that Russia has in this war, and the fact that Russia can't produce enough munitions itself to keep the war effort going, so needs to get that help from somewhere else. There's also another element in this which is important, I think, for North Korea, is that North Korea desperately wants that Russian technology. It desperately wants Russia to help it develop its spyware, as I was saying, and the amount of weapons that it can use if it wants to use them against the United States or South Korea. What is in question here is how symbolic only this trip is between Kim Jong Un and Vladimir Putin, and just what North Korea will actually get out of it from the Russians, because the Russians are not that willing to hand over their technological know-how. They're not that willing to let everybody else know what they're developing and to profit from Russian technology. So there may be some handover of some information to the North Koreans, but how much information that the Russians are actually willing to hand over is very unclear right now, because I think Russia is seeing this as a short-term effort. They're getting the munitions from North Korea to help them in the war in Ukraine, which they want to get over as quickly as possible. That doesn't mean there's a long-term military pact that's about to be signed between the two countries. So there is a possibility that North Korea will hand those weapons over, but it might come out of this deal a little bit disappointed about the fact that Russia hasn't been quite as generous as it would have liked it to have been in handing over that information technology that it could use to its advantage in the future.
A huge amount for us to get our teeth into there, Philip. Philip Turle with Global Grid, thank you very much.